Hi writers, and welcome to the Write channel where we talk all things creative writing. My name's Nicola Monaghan and I'm a prize-winning author from Nottingham in the United Kingdom, and today I'm going to talk you through how to get published through a smaller or independent publisher. So just to clarify what I'm talking about when I talk about an independent or smaller publisher, I'm talking about publishers that are still third parties, that are still businesses, that are basically publishing books on behalf of other people rather than self-publishing, which is sometimes called indie publishing, but that's quite a different thing. So when I say independent, really I mean independent of the big five rather than totally independent and working for yourself. So as I mentioned in my last video, I have been published by big five publishers. I've also been published by independent publishers, and I've also done some indie publishing myself. So I've had that whole range of experience. So I'm going to talk you through the things that I found out when I did this. I'm going to talk you through my general advice for how to find a publisher when you want to work with a slightly smaller, more independent publisher. The first thing I wanted to cover though is why you might want to go for a smaller independent publisher rather than either publishing yourself or going with one of the big five publishers. Now, a lot of people think this comes down to potentially lack of choice. You can't get a deal with a big five publisher, so you go with a smaller publisher, and sometimes that's the case. But it's not necessarily easier to get a book deal with a smaller publisher, so that doesn't necessarily work out quite as simply as that. Things a smaller publisher can do if they're publishing you as opposed to a big five publisher is they can probably give you a little bit more individual attention. If you think about the big five and they're publishing massive names like Stephen King and Salman Rushdie and that kind of thing, then they're not likely to be able to spend all of their resources and time and budgets on you as one of the littler authors. Now, independent publishers might have smaller budgets overall. They might have less money to spend on things like big advertising campaigns and stuff like that. But the resources that they do have, and certainly in terms of the people resources they do have, are more likely to be focused on you, because actually you then end up being quite a big fish, even if it is a slightly smaller pond. So that can be a massive advantage. The other thing about smaller publishers is they can be a little bit more savvy and up to date sometimes than the bigger publishers. They can be a bit more switched on about the best techniques to work with digital imprints, for example. And so they can move more quickly on those things as well. So actually sometimes working with a smaller publisher, in a weird way, you can be slightly more likely to get a hit, especially as a relatively unknown author, because you'll get that extra attention compared to going with a big publisher, but also because your publisher might operate in different, more flexible ways that can be really helpful for your career. So that's a few really good reasons why a smaller publisher might be the right thing for you. And my most recent publisher, Verve, is a smaller publisher that I would say has all those advantages and who I've really, really enjoyed working with. The other thing about a smaller publisher is that they might take a few more risks than one of the big five. So they might take on books that are not as immediately obviously commercial because they're not as driven by profits. So if you've got a book that doesn't fit categories very easily, that doesn't fit into genres very easily, that's doing something slightly different or slightly new, actually you may find that a smaller publisher looks at that a little bit more favourably than one of the big five. So it can be a way to get that kind of new innovative stuff out into the market. And some of the most exciting writing of all at the moment is being published by smaller publishers. So yet another really good reason to go this route. Another good reason for going with a small publisher, and this can be really, really important if you're writing literary fiction particularly, is that you're actually far more likely to be entered for literary awards if you're with a smaller publisher. And that's because publishers are only allowed to enter so many people. So let's really look at the top spot here at the Booker Prize. Publishers have a limit on how many people they can enter to the Booker Prize. And so if you're competing against, say, Salman Rushdie or Margaret Atwood, well, they're probably going to get the entry place ahead of you. But if you're at a smaller publisher and there are fewer of those big hitting names, then you stand a chance of actually being nominated for a big award. And although those are still long shots, at least you're in with a chance. And if you do get picked up for something like that, and there's some really good examples of this, like for example, Alison Moore, who's published by Salt, who was longlisted for the Booker Prize, shortlisted for the Booker Prize, in fact, that can be a real career-defining moment that makes all the difference to your life as a writer. So it doesn't happen for everybody. Massive lottery actually in many ways, and obviously you have to write an amazing book for that to happen to you, but it is slightly more likely to happen to you as a debut author with a smaller publisher than it is if you're with, say, Penguin Random House. There are downsides, so I'm going to be honest about that right here and now. You probably won't get a very big advance. So whereas some of the bigger publishers might give out quite big advances, not necessarily to debut fiction, but they might do if they really, really like your book and they are going to put a lot behind it, you're not likely to get that kind of advance with a smaller publisher. And actually, if you look at sales from smaller publishers, sometimes they're quite low too. So it can be slightly more of a struggle to get into the categories of being a bestseller. As I said, not always, because the way that small publishers operate, often they're a bit more flexible and a bit more savvy, and particularly with ebooks, they can actually help you do really well. So it's changed, I think, I would say, since I got into publishing. A while ago, when everything was very print focused, then smaller publishers really weren't quite as good a bet to make a living. But now you can make a living published through a smaller publisher because of how savvy they are. However, you are likely, particularly in print, to have lower sales than if you go with the traditional publisher. And another downside can be that often small publishers, particularly the savvy ones, will focus on the ebook, focus on electronic format. You might not even get a print copy. You might not even get one as an author copy. It might not be a format they publish you in, and for some people that is a big downside. That's not necessarily the case, and there are lots of smaller publishers that focus mostly on print, but it's something that can happen with some smaller publishers, and often the savvy ones where you're actually more likely to make a living through working with them are the ones where you're slightly less likely to have a print edition of your book. And of course, it's not necessarily easier to get a book deal with a smaller publisher. Just because they're smaller, they don't have lower standards, they're not necessarily easier to get your book deal with. The only side of that I would say is potentially slightly true is that they probably get slightly fewer submissions than, say, Bloomsbury or somewhere like that. The best reason to go with a smaller publisher is because you've researched them, you love what they are publishing, it fits your genre, and it's the right place for your book. So really, the best kind of publisher to choose if you're looking for a smaller publisher is one that you're a big fan of, and one where you love their books, and where you could really imagine your fiction fitting in, and where you suspect the editors might get what you're doing and understand you as a writer. So that's what you're looking for when you're looking for a smaller publisher. So how can you get published from a smaller publisher? Well, the truth is, in many ways, they don't operate that differently from the big five. They do a lot of the same things, and they will take agent submissions. So the method that I talked about in my other video about getting published with the big five, which you can view here, is equally applicable potentially in this situation. If you find an agent and get them to send submissions out for you, that could work equally well with a smaller publisher. But there are other routes in when you're working with smaller publishers, and as I mentioned before, they are a little bit more flexible and a little bit more open compared to the big five. So for example, some small publishers do take unsolicited manuscripts, and actually because they're not a huge name in the market necessarily, so they're not necessarily getting thousands and thousands and thousands a week of submissions like, for example, Penguin Random House, then there is a chance that those submissions will actually get read and get taken seriously by somebody who knows what they're doing. So unsolicited manuscripts, if they're accepted by the publisher, can be a good way in. They're not always accepted. Don't assume just because it's a smaller publisher that they will accept unsolicited manuscripts, because it's not necessarily the case. Again, what I said in my last video, what I'll say in all my videos about publishing and getting a publishing deal, make sure you research and find out whether or not they're interested in getting unsolicited manuscripts, whether or not they're interested in the genre that you're writing and they want to publish it. Look for things that they're specifically looking for and see if that fits anything you're writing. Or if they're running a particular scheme to publish a particular type of fiction, consider writing something specifically for that. So for example, a few years ago, there was a small publisher called Salt in the United Kingdom. They were looking specifically for urban stories aimed at younger adults. Now that's not young adults. They weren't looking for the YA category, but adults who were younger. So people in their 20s, for example, and they were looking for stuff that reflected urban Britain. So that's something you could specifically write to if you wanted to get published via that imprint. If you do find a small publisher that accepts unsolicited manuscripts and you're absolutely sure that they want to hear from you, then by all means send your proposal. But just like I said in my last video, make sure you send exactly what they're asking for, make sure you make the writing as good as possible, make sure you write a great synopsis. There's a video coming next week on synopses and how to write them, and make sure that your cover letter isn't stupid. And if you look below in the description, there's a link to a site by Kit Whitfield called The Other Side, and she she talks about the silly things that you can put in a letter that will put an agent off, but she also gives a really good template for you to write your letter. And I really recommend you have a look at that and use the template that she gives. Other ways to get a deal with a small publisher, it can be that they have prizes and competitions and you can send them things through that, and they might ask for an excerpt or a synopsis or a mixture of both, or even a standard proposal, but they'll often run schemes and competitions looking for new writers. They might also run something called a submissions window, so perhaps don't generally accept unsolicited manuscripts, but for a certain amount of time on a certain particular month of the year, they will take your unsolicited manuscript and take a look at it. And that's called a submissions window. So that's something worth looking out for as well. Networking can really help. Now, I know a lot of people will internally groan when they hear the word networking and think of, like, I don't know, wine and cheese or coffee at the break in a business meeting, and how they dislike having to wander the room and socialise with people that they don't know just for the point of view of getting to know them for business context. I get that completely, but networking doesn't have to be sleazy. It doesn't have to be like that. Networking can be fun. If you're networking at a writer event with people who are into writing and publishing and books, actually you just got to talk about writing and publishing books and have a great time and really enjoy yourself. So I would say, if you can, get yourself out there to writers' events and conferences. Go on courses where they provide this kind of event and you get to meet agents and editors and that kind of thing. Go to book fairs where small publishers are selling books. Buy their books and talk to them about what they're publishing. Get to know who they are, not least because if you know who they are, you'll know whether that's the right place for your book or not, and it won't just be a random place you're sending it to in the hope just to get your work out there. And so for me, although generally I'm not a natural networker, it's not something that comes naturally to me or that I enjoy in any way, when it comes to books, it's absolutely fine, because all I'm doing is meeting people who love books as much as I do and talking to them about that. And it can be really powerful because you can find out who are your tribe, who are the people who get who you are and what you want to read and what you want to write. And actually, in the context of books and publishing, it can be really quite life affirming. So try it if you can. Of course, there are lots of virtual ways to network these days, so this doesn't have to be in person at events or on courses if that's not for you, or if you can't afford to do those things. There's social media. Twitter is a really big one for writers, although Instagram is really growing for writers too. So just go and chat to people via these forums. That's much less scary than walking into a room of people you don't know, holding your coffee and biscuits nervously and looking for somebody who might make eye contact with you. So you have got options, but do try to get to know people, try to get to know what they're doing, try to make sure that you understand what they're doing. So there's no point sending somebody your crime thriller if they're a massively literary publisher. Make sure you know what they're doing and what they're about, and make sure you're a fan of what they're doing and what they're about so that your work actually fits there. Really, a lot of this is about knowledge. It's about doing your homework, doing your research, like I've mentioned many, many times in this video and the last one. It's about knowing who's out there, knowing who's looking, and knowing what they want to see and delivering that to them. Perhaps even writing something with a particular publisher in mind, because that can actually make all the difference. So really, my main first action point after this video is for you to go out and research small publishers that are local to you, or small publishers that operate in your country, or small publishers that operate globally, that are publishing the kind of work that you are writing or that you would like to write. You hadn't thought about writing before, but now you've seen that what this publisher is doing and you really like it, you would like to write it. As with everything I've said, the key to getting published is to write the best book you can. The next thing is then to make sure it fits within a genre or a marketplace that is identifiable for somebody who wants to sell that for you, like an agent, or for yourself to sell it to potentially a smaller publisher, or even, if you just happen to have that little catch of luck, a larger publisher. Then you need to make sure you know how they want to receive your work, how they want it to come to them, what kind of proposal or query they're interested in getting from you, and deliver that as perfectly as you can. So number one, write the best book you can. Number two, find out who wants that kind of book. Number three, send them the kind of proposal they're asking for. Of course, the other thing to do is to keep an eye on what's being said to you. If you're getting lots of flat rejections with form letters, then it's likely that what you're writing either doesn't fit or isn't good enough, or the proposal that you're sending isn't working. So look at that, use that as feedback in and of itself and improve your proposal. If you're getting encouraging letters, then editors, agents and people who work in publishing don't have time to write that kind of thing unless they really mean it. So take it as read. If they say that this is really good but it doesn't quite fit, or this is nearly there, anything like that, that's encouragement. That means you're moving in the right direction. Use the whole submissions process. Instead of feeling the failure of the submissions process, which I know is really hard, but instead of seeing it that way, use the entire submissions process as a feedback loop to try and make your submission as good as possible, to try and make the book better, but also to try and make the proposal better. And then hopefully, eventually, you'll find somebody who can see through what you've sent them just what it is you're trying to do and who will want to publish you and work with you. So my experience of finding a smaller publisher for my most recent novel and the novel I'm writing at the moment went like this. I was doing an MA in creative writing, in fact in crime writing at UEA, and actually we had all sorts of events along the way, lots of stuff where we met agents and editors and things like that. And at the end there was a competition that was actually run by the publisher Little Brown, and I was shortlisted for that competition, which was quite exciting because then you think, well, maybe I'll get published by Little Brown. But actually what happened was that after that shortlisting, Verve got in touch with me because they were actively looking for writers who were writing the kind of crime fiction that I was writing, and that was incredibly exciting. And so we chatted and I got to know them, and they said they'd like to publish my book, and it seemed to me to be the perfect way to publish this particular novel. I knew it fitted their lists. I knew that they were savvy and exciting as a publisher. I knew there was a possibility I wouldn't get a print book in this particular deal, although eventually I actually did. But that didn't matter to me as much as making an imprint on the market and getting my book out there and getting my face out there and known as a crime writer. So I went with Verve. So one of the things I've talked a lot about in this video and the last one is the synopsis. And obviously to sell your book, you need a really good synopsis. And people do really struggle with writing these. I've struggled with these for years. I think I'm only just getting the hang of it about 7 novels in. So they are difficult things to write. Next week, I'm going to tell you how I write my synopses and hopefully give you all the advice you need to write a killer synopsis for your own book. If you've enjoyed this video and if it's helped, please do give it a thumbs up because this stuff really helps me as a creator. And I'll hopefully see you soon again on the right channel. Thanks for watching.